you know, and getting um, these uh, these activities going. Um, okay, so I'm looking at the names and the faces here, and I think to a very large extent, most of us have some idea of Igbo history and Igbo studies, and so there are things I'm going to skip because it will be probably repeating what you already know. But let me begin really with a short summary to let you know about the few things that I would like to talk about and perhaps get us to start thinking, about in a much more critical way. I think my overall goal is to get us think about how the Igbo, a small place in the world, in many ways influenced global history. And I'm going to draw attention to perhaps three main areas to try to explore that. One area will be what historians have referred to as the Bantu migration. How come people who inhabit most of sub-Saharan Africa uh, share the same linguistic affinity? For example, the Igbo is related to the Zulu, or to Zulu as a language, or to Soto or Swana as languages. How did this happen? So I will draw on what Raphael Njoko, who came out with a brilliant book recently called Bantu Cultural Complex, to see how the Igbo, as part of the Proto-Bantu language, spread to other parts of what is today sub-Saharan Africa. And second, I will look at contemporary Atlantic history to see how the Igbo, or position the Igbo as very central to the making of early American history and culture. And when I say American, I mean, Atlantic, the Atlantic world, so to say. And third, I will talk a little bit about how the Igbo during the colonial period shaped British idea of colonialism. Indeed, the idea of reforming indirect rule as an ideological, premise upon which British colonialism was built was challenged by events among the Igbo. And I think to a very large extent that the British reformed what was basically an ideology, right, after its encounter with the Igbo. So that in many ways, we have to understand the Igbo impact in shaping British colonialism. If we have time, I'll talk a little bit about looking at the political economy of the Igbo from the 18th century, 19th century, and into the colonial period. How did the Igbo influence European industrial revolution? Because some of the most important products that fed the industrial revolution were products of tropical Africa, but most importantly, palm oil. This is something that the Igbo began to already export at the end of the slave trade, and which in many ways, reformed and transformed British industrial revolution. So I'm going to limit ourselves to those areas and perhaps then have some questions and raise some issues that may be important in furthering the debate on these issues. But I will begin really very briefly to talk a little bit about the Igbo. And I think much attention has been paid to the question of Igbo origin. Who are the Igbo? As a contested theme in Igbo studies, it remains unresolved because not much is known about the pre and early history of the Igbo people. Like many non-literate societies, a lack of written sources has clouded the discourse on the origin of the Igbo. Although there is reliance on oral traditions and archaeological evidence, Michael Echeruo has noted that debate regarding Yoruba and Edo origins remains one of the grave uncertainties about Igbo identity. However, there are three major schools of thought that characterize the scholarly discussion on Igbo origins. One is what I call the Oriental hypothesis, drawing from Afibo's characterization of this school of thought. The second is the Niger-Benue confluence theory, and the third is the autochthony theory. A long-standing debate about the Igbo origin is based on the migration theory, which claims that the ancestors of the Igbo were a branch of, quote, the lost tribe of Israel. The Oriental hypothesis, or the Igbo Hebrew ancestry narrative, has been mostly propagated by amateur historians with little training in Igbo studies. The earliest claim to a Middle Eastern ancestry, or what Adele described as the Oriental Mirage, came from Olaudia Equiano, an Igbo ex-slave who published his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudia Equiano, in 1789. Equiano's book is significant in the context of this paper for two important reasons. First, the book provides the first glimpse into the Igbo world in the 18th century. And second, part of the autobiography focuses on his life in Igbo land and seeks to construct an Igbo African or African world whose values and systems paralleled European or British societies. What emerges from Equiano's work is an Igbo world defined by institutions that include political structures, art, entertainment. What strikes Equiano as he recalls his people is the similarity the Igbo share with the Jews. Like the Jews, the Igbo practice circumcision, sacrifice, burnt offerings, and purification. Cleanliness and decency, as mentioned, were hallmarks of the Igbo religion. They avoided touching both the dead bodies or the dead and women during menstruation. Like the Jews, the Igbo, Equiano noted, believed in the Creator. In explaining this claim, Equiano wrote, "Such is the imperfect sketch my memory has furnished me with of the manner and customs of a people among whom I first drew my breath. And here I cannot forbear suggesting what has long struck me very forcibly, namely the strong analogy which even by this sketch, imperfect as it is, appears to prevail in the manner and customs of my countrymen and those of the Jews before they reached the land of promise, and particularly the patriarchs, while they were yet in that pastoral state, which is described in Genesis. This is an analogy which alone would induce me to think that the one people had sprung from the other. So Equiano's text is significant to the historian of the Igbo past. At one level, it provides some perspectives on the 18th century political, social, and economic life of Igbo land, apart from its speculations about the origin of the Igbo. Additionally, one could read Equiano's text from a political frame that challenges 18th century European preoccupation with the Enlightenment ideals and Western epistemology. Beyond his intended objectives of writing the book as a political text, Equiano presents presentations of a parallel culture, at least one in which the Igbo, his people, who became the representatives of the African continent in his narrative, share similar ideals and ideas as the Enlightenment Europe, offers an opportunity to affirm the humanity of Africans. It further challenges any prejudice against Africans that is based solely on skin color, since the Igbo had attained a level of advancement comparable to the Jews in cultural terms. Equiano's early references to an Igbo-Hebrew connection has often been referenced in support of Eastern origin of the Igbo. Early European visitors to Igbo land also referred to an Igbo-Jewish connection. George Barsden drew attention to the deep spirituality of the Igbo people as perhaps rooted in the Levitical code. Jeffries came to similar conclusions. Jeffries drew attention to cultural and spiritual systems, especially of the Nri in northern Igbo land, including venerations of the sun and duality in social structures and organizations, as probably of Egyptian origin. However, Adiele Afibo, a pioneer Igbo scholar, dismissed these claims as a fallacy well rooted in the Hermetic hypothesis, since the Nri can be regarded as a subgroup of the Igbo. Yet, attention to this school of thought has gained some currency. Daniel Lees, whose doctoral dissertation later published as Jewish Identity Among the Igbo of Nigeria, Israel, the Lost Tribe, and the Question of Belonging in the Jewish State, addressed the history of the Igbo's long time and controversial narrative of a possible Jewish origin. His work engenders a new reading of Igbo history and the elusive quest for origin. His work, similarly, in the documentary Reimagining the Jews of Nigeria, Jeff Lieberman brought significant attention to the contemporary discourse on Igbo Jewish ancestry and the question of identity. The documentary focused on both the search for identity and Judaic practices among some Igbo seeking a return to their Hebrew roots. These works are a response to an increasing claim of Jewish ancestry by some Igbo scholars and the expansion of Judaism among the Igbo. But these claims of Igbo-Hebrew connections are speculative and part of what I mentioned earlier as the Oriental hypothesis, which has no basis in historical fact. Until such a link is factually established, one must look elsewhere in order to establish how the Igbo emerge as a distinct ethnic group. The historian, however, must look for other forms of evidence to explain early Igbo history. Archaeological and linguistic evidence provides some clues. Such evidence has given rise to the Niger-Benue conflict theory in explaining Igbo origin. This theory gained currency after archaeological discoveries associated with the Nok culture. Scholars such as Kaman and Adiele Afibo have drawn attention to the possibility of the region holding the key to the elusive question of Igbo origin. Relying on linguistic evidence, Afibo argues that the Igbo, like their immediate neighboring Kwa speakers, probably originated through dispersal from the Niger-Benue conflicts. Related to the Niger-Benue conflicts theory is the claim that the antiquity of yam production may explain the origin in the forest savanna borderland. A more recent fascinating book by B.O.N.L.O.W.A., titled Adonidu, History of Igbo Origin, merges the two traditions of origin. He concludes that the Igbo and Edo possibly originated from Canaan and migrated into Egypt following the series of wars in the land around 900 BCE. Having acquired the knowledge of iron working by the middle of the 9th century BCE, the group known as Adonidu migrated, left Egypt and probably arrived Kukawa on the bank of Lake Chad towards the end of the 19th century. The migration continued into Zaria and finally the territory that became known as Empire of Adonidu, probably around 800 to 750 BCE. The Igbo and related ethnic groups then occupied most of what is Yoruba land today and the northern fringes of these territories. Related to the internalist argument is the Yoruba tradition that placed the Igbo at Ife when Oduduwa, the mythical founder of the Yoruba people, arrived there. The word Igbo appears in both Yoruba and Igbo place names. Ife historian Ademakina Wa has suggested that the Igbo retain the names of their original population of southern Nigeria. Hence, according to Okoro Ijoma, we find among the Yoruba place names such as Oke-Igbo, Ijebu-Igbo, as well as the word Igbo attached to other place names. Eluwa contends that it was the Igbo opposition to Yoruba strategy to usurp power in the metropolis of Ife that led to the massive migration from Ado to Ado of the Igbo, along with other sympathetic tribes. The southward migration was what led them from Ife to Ado and later to Benin, and finally to the eastern banks of the River Niger, as related in the migration history of Onisha. Indeed, these stories of Igbo origin have been seen as consistent attempt by those who seek an Orientalist origin to present local historical developments as outcomes of migration from Egypt. But such claims still face important historical challenges, evidence that goes beyond mere speculation. Moreover, there is an internalist perspective or hypothesis. This hypothesis locates the original home of the Igbo on the northern Igbo plateau. This theory has identified core catchment areas in the Nri Oka, Owerri Olo, and Okigwe as the area of primary dispersal. Proponents of this theory of Igbo origin point to the environmental changes that have occurred as a result of human habitation and subsequent transformation of the original rainforest. They argued that the derived savanna vegetation in the Nri Oka and Owerri Olo areas is evidence of early human habitation and long use. Oral and archaeological evidence supports the antiquity of Igbo habitation here. The lack of migration history supports the fact that people who inhabited these regions for centuries have lost any history of migrating from anywhere. The lack of migration history supports the fact that people have inhabited these regions for centuries. Archaeological evidence finds found in Ezuku Okpa Rock Shelter near Afikpo have yielded Stone Age tools and pottery that date back to 2935 BCE. Similar finds at Nsoka sites include human habitations dating back to 2556 BCE. The Ibuku finds further support a long history of human habitation and development in this region. The question of Igbo origin remains an unsettled issue and gaining a holistic knowledge of Igbo people and their early history requires a systematic study of available evidence. Linguistically, the Igbo speak a language that belongs to the large family of languages known as the Kwa language family, which includes Yoruba, Ijaw, Edo, Idoma, Nupe, and Igala. These languages began to separate from each other some 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. It is enough to suggest that the Igbo must have inhabited their present homeland for millennia. Yet, the early migration and settlement patterns of the Igbo continue to confound scholars, and something that perhaps needs to be better explored. I'll speak a little bit on the political economy of the Igbo. The Igbo economy, or the political economy of the Igbo, was subsistence based largely on agriculture, fishing, and small-scale craft manufacture for most of its early history until the mid-17th century. The prominence of agriculture is evidence, or the predominance of agriculture is evidenced by a long history of domestication of a large variety of food crops and edible plants. The crops and plants that attest to the antiquity of agriculture among the Igbo, as identified by Bede Okibo, includes African rice, Guinea corn, bulrush millet, hungry rice, Bambara groundnut, cowpeas, amongst others. The accounts of captives of Igbo origin in the New World provide useful and rare glimpses into the agricultural and exchange economy of the Igbo before European colonization. An important source is the autobiography of Olaude Equiano, who was born in 1745 and sold into slavery at the age of 11. Equiano recorded in his biography the history of his knowledge of the economic life of his people. Regarding agriculture, he wrote, "Agriculture is our chief employment, and everyone, even the children and women, are engaged in it. Thus, we are all habituated to labor from early years." Equiano's description of Igbo ancestry or Igbo society and economy in the 18th century is supported by the accounts given by another enslaved Igbo in the Caribbean. Archibald Montet, born about 1799 in Igbo land and enslaved in Jamaica during the Atlantic slave trade, affirmed in his memoir that yams, potatoes, and Guinea corn were an integral part of Igbo agriculture in the 17th century. 19th century European accounts also offer perspectives. In his journey to Bonny in 1840, Hermann Kohl, a German doctor, took notice of that the Igbo exported agricultural products and metal goods to Bonny. He described Igbo land as rich in natural products, maize, rice, yams, oil palm, dyewood, cotton, and so on, and was, quote, quite indispensable in the provision of staples, foods for Bonny. E.W. Carey, who visited Ndoki in 1866, was impressed by the abundance of agricultural produce among other provisions in the market. He quotes, "It abounds in corn, palm wine, rum, fish, deer flesh, dog flesh, cats, fowl, tobacco, yam, eggs, spices, pineapple, palm oil, including other products such as cassava." A.B. Harcourt describes seemingly extreme fertile lands and yam plantations expanding for miles in all directions during an expedition to Marquette in 1896. In a journey to Nsugbe and Nteje in 1897, Smith observed what would obviously be classified as women's crops. I noticed, he quote, growing in Nteje farms, pepper, cotton, black rice, cassava, and several other edible useful plants. The prodigy and efficiency of Eza farmers of northern Igbo land, especially their efficient application of manure made from leaves, crop remains, and animal dungs, and night soil, impressed European visitors in the early 20th century. Sir Egerton described the Eza as thrifty and excellent farmers. Miss Holbrook, who visited Umudioka near Ugidi in 1904, recognized the complementary role played by both sexes in agriculture. The people on the whole are very industrious. The women especially, one seldom finds them in leisure. Very often, they are out helping the men plant or tend the yams or planting cassava or on their own account. Although pre-European Igbo farmers produced primarily for subsistence, trade was an integral part of the economic system. But I'm going to argue that the nature of Igbo economy shaped other aspects of life, spirituality, labor relations, and gender ideology. The unit of production was the family, made up of a man, his wives or wives, and their unmarried children. Polygamy and large families ensured a large labor force. Although the allocation of work was not strictly gendered, sex, age, and status were important markers of differentiation. Men and women complemented each other to meet the subsistent need of the household, lineage, or community. Yam, the most important and widely cultivated crop among the Igbo, shaped social, economic, and ecological, as well as demographic dynamics of the people and their habitat. Alexander Falconbridge, during his trip to the Bight of Biafra in the second half of the 18th century, noted that yam are the favorite food of the Igbo. The Reverend George Basden, who worked among the Igbo, referred yam as the Igbo staff of life. He observed that yam stand for the Igbo as potato does for the typical Irishman. No wonder yam cultivation is highly ritualized and venerated through Ahajoko, the yam spirit. Ahajoko ceremonies are important because yam is believed to possess spirits, and certain sanctions have to be observed to ensure good yield and continuity of life itself. Culture and settled life supported the development of a complex social and ritual system associated with yam cultivation, yam festivals, yam deities, and yam titles. The development of these rituals associated with the yam cult is important in the expression of power and important aspects of power relations among the Igbo, namely the domination of ritual functions by men and the social prestige attached to the status of Ezeji or the Yam King. Yam production and the development of yam rituals led to the development of complex social systems and triggered an era of property ownership controlled by strong men who aspired to become title holders. Now, I have brought a couple of these background to get us think about how the Igbo society and their political economy may have shaped the other parts of the world. So I'll talk briefly about the Igbo and the transformation of sub-Saharan Africa. Linguistically, as I spoke earlier, the Igbo speak a language that belongs to the Kwa group of languages, or the Bantu group known as the Niger Congo. Close to 100 million people across the southern half of Africa speak related languages, collectively known as Bantu languages. Scholars have explained this through the phenomenon known as the Bantu migration or expansion. The comparative linguistic analysis of the languages spoken in parts of Eastern Nigeria, Central and Southern Africa show similarities with the Proto-Bantu languages originally spoken in the areas bordering Eastern Nigeria and Cameroon. What gave rise to the Bantu cultural complex that began about 1000 BCE and continued to the 4th century? In a series of migration, scholars have identified Bantu speakers scattering throughout Central and Southern Africa, interacting with and absorbing indigenous populations as they spread. Linguistic evidence shows that the Proto-Bantu emerged in what is today Nigeria and Cameroon by 2000 BCE. And that is the area of, Igbo land, Cross River, and parts of Western Cameroon. So my argument is that the ancestors of the Igbo people were most probably part of the Proto-Bantu speakers, whose knowledge of agriculture, especially their tuber production and iron working skills, helped them to colonize the rest of the continent south of the Sahara. Some scholars speculate that overpopulation encouraged some groups to move away in search of new and fertile land for agriculture. It's important to emphasize that both the development of agriculture and the existence of an unusually high population density have been defining characteristics of the Igbo homeland. As part of the Bantu cultural complex, the Igbo contributed to the making of what is today's sub-Saharan African culture by spreading the knowledge of agriculture and iron technology to areas where they were unknown until much more recent times. In the area of Igbo contribution to the Atlantic history, I want to emphasize that the Igbo also shaped global history from the 15th century. The Bight of Biafra hinterland was a major contributor to the human cargo of the infamous Atlantic slave trade. The demographics of the Atlantic slave trade in what is today known as the Transatlantic Database, compiled by David Eltis and other scholars, suggests that many enslaved people of African origin came from the Bight of Biafra. David Eltis and David Richardson estimate that 1 in 7 Africans shipped to the New World during the whole period of the transatlantic slave trade originated from the Bight of Biafra. This corresponds to an estimated 11.9% of the total number of whom we have available data. Douglas Chambers suggests also that 11.6 million people estimated to have been shipped to the New World between 1470 and 1860. Some 1.7 million were transported from the Bight of Biafra. So he estimates that 80% of those from the Bight of Biafra were Igbo speaking and reached the Americas in British ships. I have some data that I think in many ways would suggest the number of people who came from the Bight of Biafra and where they were concentrated. Now, if these estimates are accepted, it then means that such concentration of Igbo exiles hold important consequences for the development of slavery and the slave society in British America and the making of early American history and culture. Now, I have some data here that I think very interesting from the Bight of Biafra between 1527 and 1866. The number of Africans who ended up in places like Jamaica was 266,191. This is some rough estimate, and that's probably about 25%. And for Virginia in the US, it was 28,159, about 28%. And for Dominican, Barbados, and so on and so forth. These data give us some window into where the Igbo ended up in the Americas. Now, Igbo identity in the New World was defined in many ways by their attitude towards slavery and their enslavement. And what I'm trying to argue here, of course, is that the Igbo attitude towards the institution of slavery was fundamental in terms of not only shaping the institution of slavery itself, but also the attitude towards enslaved people of Igbo origin. No other ethnic group has been as misrepresented in the Atlantic world as the Igbo. At the root of this misrepresentation is a body of myths and stereotypes about the Igbo, And this was really, so ubiquitous in slavers and planters' accounts. Yet scholars have not done enough to dispel such myths or to explain them in terms of understanding Igbo characteristics and the basis of their response to slavery from their own history and in Africa itself. Yet, more than any other group from the shores of Africa, the captives taken from the Bight of Biafra received special attention for their characteristics and were subject to numerous stereotypes. Various locations across America, including South Carolina, who had an intense prejudice towards these captives, simply refused to accept imports from the Bight of Biafra. The Igbo were seen as, quote, lazy, despondent, suicidal, melancholy, superstitious, and sickly. And planters from South Carolina preferred slaves from Senegambia or the Gold Coast. Other areas, including Haiti, viewed the Biafran slaves as prone to suicide. And in Jamaica, a popular perception of Igbo slaves was that they were manageable but deceitful, and also suicidal if they receive mistreatment. These stereotypes gives some indication of how the Igbo Africans responded to the institution of slavery. As Philip Morgan argues, Igbos were one group to produce a marked divergence between their known proportions among immigrants and runaways. Data from South Carolina immigrants runaways slave runaways show that the Igbos were represented, the Igbo only represented 5% of the non-immigrant population in the area, and a total roughly of 62%, or about 10% of those who ran away, in the area. Furthermore, Michael Gomez has reported the high proportion of Igbo women who appear in runaway populations, attributed this to the fact to the various freedoms that women enjoyed in several areas of several arenas of African society, such as the ability to participate in battles, their dominance in the local exchange of goods, and the ability to grow their own crops, and even sell these in the market in order to accumulate personal wealth. If we accept Gomez's interpretation, one can associate the existence and prevalence of male Igbo runaways to the freedoms and democratic institutions and social mobility enjoyed in their indigenous African culture. Despite the fragmentary nature of information on the Igbo diaspora, some tentative conclusions can be made. In mainland North America, the discriminatory tendencies of planters throughout the colonies resulted in distinct patterns of ethnic distribution. Such patterns, Gomez argues, assist immensely in any analysis of subsequent sociocultural developments, operating under the premise that Black life and culture in any given area evolved out of and in creative tensions with norms associated with specific ethnic groups imported via the slave trade. Gomez argues, for example, that Virginia and Maryland developed a survived population largely out of Igbo in majority and Akan antecedents. Both groups were largely rural, their diets equally dependent upon root crops. Douglas Chamber identified, therefore, evidence of Igbo continuities or what he calls Igboisms in Anglophone American slave societies. The vegetable okra, for example, a staple in the slave diet and one-pot cooking practices, Douglas concludes, is Igbo in origin. Yams, black-eyed beans, greens, as important dietary habits forming African-American soul food also have strong Igbo roots. There is evidence of Igbo influence in power dynamics or what David Fisher has defined as, quote, attitude towards authority and power and patterns of political participation. Enslaved people of Igbo origin in the Americas drew on the African background and social resources in order to reorder their lives. They often employed what James Scott called everyday forms of resistance, such as suicide, non-compliance, escape, or concessional negotiation to deal with their status as enslaved people. Igbo political consciousness in the Americas is evident in the proportionately higher number of enslaved men and women who ran away from the institution of slavery. Their response to Igbo, the response to Igbo, of the Igbo to enslavement drew from the African background. Their independent spirit and resistance to enslavement can be traced to Igbo land itself. This is particularly important in the case of Igbo women who were prominent in the political, economic, and social structures of their society. Indeed, Igbo society had established high regards for women's role as reflected in the veneration and popularity of the eighth goddess, Allah, which symbolized the perfection of gender balance. Igbo women exhibited these same tendencies and independent spirits in the New World. At the cosmological level, the Igbo retained aspects of their spiritual worldview. Through the recreation of their familiar world, the Igbo sought to maintain contact with the spirit world and their personal god, Chi. Such institutions as Ahajoko or the Yam Spirit Cult and Okonko societies that originated in Igbo homeland were recreated in the diaspora, where the Igbo combined these essentially shared traditions with Creole institutions in the Jonkono masquerade festivals. The Igbo identity in the New World was defined by the attitude towards slavery and their enslavement. No other ethnic group has. Chamber also, draws attention to the other evidence of Igbo continuities in the New World, such as the transmission of their healing or doctoring system called Obia in the New World, but this is basically Dibia. The strong link between the functions of Obia men and women in the diaspora and the functions of Dibia, or medicine men and women in Igbo land, helped the Igbo to make sense of their new world by drawing on ancestral traditions and planting them firmly in their new environment. People of Igbo ancestry helped to raise the major debate that shaped the post-abolition world, the discourse on abolition in particular. Olade Equiano, I mentioned earlier, was one of the most prominent persons of Igbo descent and who, in many ways, instigated the discourse and debate over the abolition of the slave trade. By 1788, Great Britain, after profiting enormously from the slave trade for generations, had begun to establish, began the debate on the question of abolition. Equiano, who had purchased his own freedom, presented a petition to the Queen in that year, as part of a broad coalition opposed to slavery. And of course, his interesting narrative, which became a bestseller, provided one of the most important evidence for those for the abolition agenda. The book not only became a bestseller, it gave impetus to the British debate for the abolition of the slave trade. It is one of the earliest books published by a Black African writer and helped influence the British Parliament to abolish the slave trade through the Slave Act of 1807. It is generally argued that although Equiano opposed the institution of slavery on moral grounds, it was changing economic forces that led to the abolition of the slave trade itself. And here, these changing economic circumstances was one also in which the Igbo would play a very important role. And that is the emergence of commodity trade in the post-abolition period. The Atlantic slave trade, of course, the abolition of the slave trade also brought enormous changes in the Igbo and helped the Igbo influence global economic systems. Now, Kenneth Dickey's book, Trade and Politics on the Niger Delta, examines the socioeconomic and political effects of the abolition of the slave trade on Niger Delta communities. These processes had important implications for the Igbo and the Bight of Biafra hinterland. The transition for the Igbo, like many other societies, involved the mechanisms for adapting to the end of the slave trade and to the new commodity trade based on the production and marketing of palm oil. The Igbo were expanding into expanding the production of palm oil even before the abolition itself. By the beginning of the 19th century, a considerable quantity of palm oil was being exported to Liverpool and other European destinations. The original development of the palm oil trade was therefore associated with the slave traffic. The Igbo contribution to the growth of the Industrial Revolution can be understood by the dependency of early industrial development in Europe to palm oil from the Bight of Biafra. The European Industrial Revolution and the end of the slave trade therefore, has this sort of relationship in which the Igbo became central to the emerging global economy of the late 19th century. There was increasing interest in Europe in African agricultural products due to the Industrial Revolution. The growing industrial development in Europe created demands for palm oil and palm kernel. The trade in palm oil, which began in 17th century and 18th century, had replaced the trade in slaves by the 1860s. The Igbo responded to the transition from slave trade to commodity trade by introducing innovations that enabled them to increase production for export. The development of the trade in palm oil and later palm kernel helped in further exploitation and occupation of the rainforest in order to support the demand from abroad. It increased in importance by the middle of the 19th century from about 4,700 tons of palm oil in 1827 to about 13,943 tons in 1834. By the 1830s, Britain was importing about 10,000 tons of palm oil a year. Between 1855 and 1856, another 26,000 tons of palm oil was exported through the Bight of Biafra. Palm kernels, a product dominated by Igbo women, became an important export in the 1870s, following its demand for soap making, margarine production, and residue for cattle feed. The transition engendered social change among the Igbo, especially in the areas of gender relations. The transformations and transitions that began with the ending of the slave trade and the emergence of commodity trade set in motion significant changes in gender relation or particularly over the control of palm oil and its production. Among the Igbo, women's labor and participation was crucial to the economic revolution of the 19th century and the expansion in the production in the oil palm industry. The increasing demand for palm kernel, which became economically important in the 1860s and 1870s, relied heavily on women's labor. Despite the odious task of processing this kernel, the product became an important source of income for women. Overall, the production of palm kernel and palm kernels contributed immensely to the Industrial Revolution and the transition and transformation of Igbo society. The role of the Igbo in shaping the global economy continued in the era of colonialism. British imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century and the reactions and responses of Igbo led to further transformation of the Igbo society. Now, I don't know how we're doing with time. I can end up in the next 10 minutes.
I think if you end now, I think we can begin our discussion.
Okay, so let me just take a minute or two to basically talk about this section. What I argue probably that perhaps to understand the role of the Igbo in shaping global politics in the era of colonialism, one has to look at how Igbo resistance to British colonialism, particularly the 1929 Women's Revolt, led to British rethinking of Lugar's philosophy of the dual mandate, the institution of warrant chiefs, and its replacement with other forms of native administration. And this is not just what applied to Igbo land. It became applicable to British colonies throughout, sub-Saharan Africa. And particularly also the idea of trying to understand African societies and the anthropological works that began in the wake of the Women's Revolt led to the commissioning of hundreds of British anthropologists who produced these histories that inform how we understand mid-20th century Africa in their works, which includes these intelligence reports and political memoranda that has been an important source for reconstructing some of the history of Igbo land in the pre-colonial period. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I will be glad to respond to any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for this magnificent lecture. And could you guys help me, give a round of applause for our professor lecturer? Thank you very much. Thank you. I can't even begin to summarize the plethora of information and bits of knowledge and wisdom you've given us. So rather than go through what you've given us, I will let the floor open for questions, reactions, discussions. And please, in order for us to organize it orderly, you raise your hand and I will unmute you, or you unmute yourself. And I think I see Professor Francoise Gochuku raising her hand. So you raise your hand and then you ask your question, or you express your concern, or you make your comments. Thank you, Francoise.
Yeah, thank you. I was very interested in what you talked about concerning the theory of lost Jewish, trail back to the lost tribe of Israel, because I've met with Daniel List. There's also a lady, I think, in Germany that has been working on that. But these people have worked from the outside in, and there is nobody so far that I know that has worked from inside out. And for example, you mentioned the circumcision, but it's not just circumcision, obviously. It's circumcision on the 8th day, and the levirate marriage, and there are lots and lots of them. And I've been attending a Jewish webinar with a rabbi from Bet Shemesh, Israel for some 2-3 years now. And the more I'm just attending that because I was invited, you know, but what struck me along the weeks, because it's weekly, is that there are lots and lots of things that he was mentioning about the Jews that I found as a part of everyday life in traditional Igbo land. And the problem we find is that many people now, many Igbos have grown up outside Igbo land, be it in Lagos or Abuja or abroad, and they don't even know, you know, the traditional Igbo land. And I was blessed because my husband is from a traditional family, you know, from Newi, and who have been very, very traditional in that family. And so I found out that there are so many things like the attitude to women, the purification of women, the attitude to children, there are lots and lots. And even the attitude to meat, food, there are lots of them. And I thought it would be very interesting to dig more into that and find out, you know, because many people have said, oh, well, that is, forget about it, it's not real, they are really autochthonous, or, you know, but what would be interesting is, apart from all these, you know, migration theories, is to find out why they are so close to Israel, and Leviticus in particular.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think, can I respond?
Yeah.
Yes, Professor. And before you respond, could I forgot to say that we'll keep our comments very short so that we get as many as possible because we're running out of time. And after that, I will read, there's a comment in the chat section, and we will do that. So Prof, go ahead, please.
Okay, I think that's really very interesting. I you know, fortunately, I was actually part of Daniel's dissertation committee because they wanted somebody in Basel. They wanted somebody who has ethnographic knowledge, and I found some of his work interesting. I mean, some of the work interesting sitting on that dissertation committee. Now, when I was growing up, I think I was probably 7. You know, my father has no background in history or anything. He never went to school. But my father told me, you know, I remember we're going to the farm one evening, and he said, you know, we're talking about stuff, and he told me that, you know, so he told me that, you know, that the Igbo people, we are Jews, you know, and I never thought about it because I didn't know much about, you know, the Jews, and I didn't know about, you know, there was certain things he mentioned about the Igbo and Jews. It started making more sense to me. Certainly, there are several aspects of Igbo tradition and cultural practices that relate to that are similar to those of you know, the Jews. So you mentioned circumcision on the 8th day. I've tried to check. I don't see any other culture that performs circumcision on the 8th day, right? Historically. So those 8 market days are sort of important in terms of how people are named, you know, and burial practices. But I think what we have failed to really understand is perhaps how this, even if this migration took place, whether the migration is from the north to the south or from the south to the north. We don't have evidence of that. But perhaps that if these were practices, if we go by, you know, what, you know, people like Catherine Achelano had written, you know, that, so we can locate the origin of these practices actually in Igbo land, right? So that we're looking always through migration from Egypt towards the south, rather than the possibility that migration might also have taken place from the south to the north. That these are practices here that the Igbo transmitted, you know, into other areas. But those similarities are very striking. And I think one other way people have tried to deal with this is to use DNA, you know, to see how does the Igbo, I mean, do we share the same DNA with, you know, Jewish people? You know, that came from nothing. I mean, they didn't come up with anything definitive. But you know, you have people like Remi Ilono who are pushing this idea that, you know, these connections are there. But the thing is, we don't have much evidence, you know, to support this apart from these you know, these you know, these similarities and practices. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have one hand up, and before, okay, two hands up, and a reaction by Dr. Raphael Njoko. He says that, you know, I think I'll paraphrase his comments. He says that the idea that the Igbos in the diaspora, the Igbo slaves resorted to suicide contradicts the notion that that the Igbos are intrinsically, inherently, in the notion of the Igbo culture, that the Igbo culture is inherently against suicide. How does one resolve that difference? So keep that in mind, and we'll get two more reactions and questions, and then you can take all the three reactions together, and then we begin to wrap up our this wonderful discussion. So Kingsley Ezowa, could you please? Can
you see my comments?
Okay, I haven't seen it. So Kingsley, unmute yourself and then you make your comments. And Adamo, you unmute yourself as well after Kingsley's, and then I'll read Professor those comments, and then we'll wrap up. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is on Igbo political economy. I want to know how we can establish the evolution of Igbo business apprenticeship, that is Igba boy, what I call Igba boy. So I also want to know if it is possible to attribute the origin of the practice in Nigeria to the Igbo in particular.
Okay, thank you very much. Adamo, unmute yourself, Adam.
Prof,
okay.
Ndewo.
Great, Ndewo.
Thank you very much for such a very heavy meal. I don't know how many course meal we are going to describe this as. I think I don't know how to describe. Thank you very much. I just want to, you said that scholars have not done enough to dispel such myths about that the Igbo ethnic group has been one of the most represented, and that scholars have not done enough to dispel such myths. And that means that there is a huge study gap in that, from that perspective. And describing the Igbo as lazy, melancholic, suicidal, and a lot of things, manageable but deceitful. I begin to wonder, because when you read a text like Achebe's Arrow of God, Things Fall Apart, Akachi Adimorezibo's The Last of the Strong Ones, and the rest of them, you begin to wonder if people who make this kind of comments about the Igbo can actually stand and say, yes, we know the people we are talking about. So the issue of that fragmentary nature of information on Igbo in diaspora is also very important. And talking about Virginia and the rest of them, where you now have an artificially constructed Igbo village, you know, proper Igbo village and things like that. I wonder how such things will contribute into this discourse that we are in. Then another question I want to ask is, I was very, do I say impressed or surprised about the abundance of agricultural produce in the pre-colonial Igbo land. And I'm wondering, does the region still have this kind of identity from that agricultural perspective, where we now have to import, you know, a lot of things from a lot of places? And these are just what have been going on in my mind. And I also want to talk about the issue of using the literary that's literary texts in trying to trace some of these origins. There are a lot of them from West Indies, from Caribbean society like Unburnable, Bekalam, and the rest of them. I found out that in this you can find traces of this Igbo and the issue in relation to the issue of slavery. So I find this actually very, 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 very good, trying to establish this relationship between Igbos at home and Igbos in the diaspora. And I think this is an area I want you to talk more on, because I know that there are a lot of things you have that you have not mentioned. I really want you to speak more on this, and I hope we get this paper at the end of the day.
Thank you very
so
much.
much once again. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Ada. Professor Azodo, I did not find your reaction.
I wonder.
Could you please raise
what
your...
What am I doing wrong? How do I post it to everybody?
Anyway, just use this opportunity to
okay, what I wrote is, I may be mistaken, but I didn't hear about the theory of the Igbo origin.
Okay.
Because the speaker spoke about the Igbos coming in from somewhere, all the way from Niger down to Yoruba land, and then to Benin, and then finally to where they are now. When you look at the Igbo theory, it actually says that, the theory, it says that the Igbos are, what is the word? They originated from Nri area of what is Nigeria today. And from there, they have spread to Anoma and all the other places.
Okay.
I'm not sure I heard about this aspect of the Nri theory of the Igbo origin and how that plays into all the travel from outside.
All right, thank you very much. So,
Father Ichozona, can you give me 1 minute? I've been raising my hand. Ukewu.
Okay.
Yeah, just a reaction to these theories of origin. I am not a student of Igbo history and Igbo culture, but it intrigues me that quite often the issue of cultural similarity is used as a basis of trying to establish the origin of the Igbo or the affinity to the Jews. Sometimes we don't talk of the things we do or we did as Igbo that the Jews did not do. The Jews did not circumcise women in their time. And I doubt that you can find it in anywhere in the Bible or Igbo, Jewish custom. So that is one thing that Jews did not do, but the Igbos did. The issue of 8-day circumcision. I think it was Basden who mentioned that circumcision could take in Igbo land could take place on the 3rd day or the 4th day or even the 8th day or the 12th day. It depended on the community, according to Basden. The issue of levirate marriage. Levirate marriage is an economic phenomenon, and many societies in the world practiced it. And in fact, today in East Africa, among places, some places in Kenya, you have solid levirate marriage taking place. Some Kenyan communities have opposed their governments trying to make levirate marriage illegal as recently as 2014. So my theory, my contribution to this is that using cultural similarity to tie us to the Jews, I don't think it is a stronger approach. In fact, the Igbos are more able to understand their culture by studying other African cultures.
All right,
by studying the Jews. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Korieh, could you attend to the questions asked before we forget them?
Yeah,
and then we'll see whether we have time for more.
I will react to some of this, you know. Now, Ralph had asked about, you know, the contradictions. I think I did a paper once that was published in Dialectical Anthropology. How does one understand how conditions, as you know, such as the institution of slavery, inform the Igbo attitude and response to it, particularly suicide, right? And I think I struggled with that because suicide is something among the Igbo people that is really abhorred, and that doesn't occur often in traditional Igbo society. But in the Atlantic world, one can see that as really a response to the institution of slavery. And I think my argument was that the Igbo, unlike many other societies, came from a background where, you know, their individualism and autonomy, the absence of a centralized political institution, marked them different from the Yoruba, for example, who came from centralized political powers and institutions, or in Senegambia, where, you know, there were slaveholding societies. The Igbo were so different in terms of the political and social context from which they were uprooted. And so their response to slavery was very radical. And I think if you look at the story of the Igbo landing in Georgia, that these Igbo people went back to the sea and drowned as a whole, we also have to understand people's perception of what happens when people die, right? For them, slavery and the Americas was a foreign land. The sense of home perhaps provide justification for suicide. And when people die, you know, they can go back home. They can go back to their society. They can go back to what they were familiar with. And so that is one way in which one can understand how circumstances can affect people's psychology and the response to the institution of, to events such as suicide. So I struggle with that myself, but I think there's no other way to explain it. Now, Kingsley, you asked about the apprenticeship system. I think the apprenticeship system is probably, it may exist in other societies, but I think it's a uniquely Igbo. But one has to look at it from the kind of political economy also that had existed, at least in the past, whether it is in the form of trade or craft. How do you pass that craft? And most of the apprenticeship system actually began with people passing on these skills to, you know, family members and kin members. I think the new form of apprenticeship system, you know, that expanded with, you know, the new economy and migration and trade, right, is different from the indigenous apprenticeship system that in many ways was close linked to membership of a guild or membership of a you know, family members and so on and so forth. But so I think it's sort of expanded. What one has to look at how this apprenticeship system has transformed over time as part of, you know, passing on skills, right? How it became also commercialized, you know, where people have to pay to learn some trade. In the past, it was not the same. So I am not an expert in that, but I think the interesting thing would be to look at how the apprenticeship system has changed from its indigenous, you know, origin to when the economy expanded and people engaged in more, you know, in trade, and urbanization, movement into the cities and urban areas and trading activities that require, more hands and more training, as forms of assistance. Yeah, I think really the idea of myths and stereotypes of the Igbo in the New World. And I think this was, why I refer to some of them as stereotypes, because, but in a way, I characterize them as different forms of response to slavery, just as we looked at, suicide. There are other forms of resistance. We can characterize slacking, feigning, that you're sick within this system of production as forms of resistance. It doesn't have to be suicide alone. It doesn't have to be run away alone. It doesn't have to, there are other forms of subtle, resistance that people employed. But anyway, so in the case of the Igbo, I think also there are some basic ideas that distinguished the Igbo from the other slaves. They didn't accept their servitude lightly. And I think some of these ways of characterizing the Igbo was because most planters saw them as bad investment, right? Bad investment. If you buy a slave and the slave commits suicide, you lost your money. And their stereotypes were, okay, we don't want slaves coming from the Bight of Biafra. Yeah, we want slaves coming from this side because they are more, they don't respond just as the Igbos did. And most of those planters never went to Africa themselves, but they identified that people who came from the Bight of Biafra, were fair-skinned. I mean, if you go to Jamaica, I went to Jamaica, they called me Red Igbo. I asked them why. They say, yeah, all Igbo people who came here are fair-skinned, and they call them Red Igbo, right? And so those stereotypes were there, but we can characterize them as part of, different forms of resistance, or what James Scott called everyday forms of resistance. Okay, so, Madam President, the Nri theory, I think is part of also the Oriental hypothesis, because the Nri, draw this origin of the origin from Eri in the Bible, right? And so it's also pointing to the same Oriental hypothesis. But I think, people like Mwezigwe have dismissed this, but we have to look at, really, there are different, perhaps different cultural groups that make up the Igbo. The Nri will be part of them as, maybe ritual specialists, things like that. The Isu, Isu, and, would be one of them. I was talking about this, yesterday with somebody, I think. So, and those have the Nkwere, Isu Nkwere, in terms of craft and iron smithing and stuff. The Nri, and as ritual specialists. This sort of maybe a useful way to look at the Igbo as really made up of, different distinct groups inhabiting this area. And I think just like we talked about the Oriental hypothesis, the Nri is part of it. It's part of that hypothesis because we have no evidence that Eri ever came to Nri, or that they have any direct link to the Bible. We don't have that evidence, and most of those writing this history, writing these stories are speculating, until we see the evidence or concrete evidence. Yes. So, Professor Okewu, I think, yeah, you're right. I think you're the last question. You're right in terms of looking at these. We have to be wary of using cultural similarities as historical evidence, because I mean, if people like Diop have done that in terms of looking at Egypt and Senegal and drawing all these similarities. There are a lot of similarities, yes. These may have originated, independently of one another, and may have no basis for establishing them through these. But I think Boston is wrong in terms of circumcision taking place. I think usually the evidence is that they happen on a particular day, using the 8 Marquette day to know when to circumcise. I have no idea of the origin of female circumcision and why actually it also, was done, unlike the Jews. But those are practices that I think maybe if we dig deeper, we can find the sociology of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. As my mother would say, when you begin to snore, then you know you're enjoying the sleep. And we are beginning to snore, and we're enjoying this wonderful lecture. But everything that is sweet has its end. And we take one more question from Biko, Dr. Professor Biko says that, could you comment on the Igbo tradition of nonviolence and tolerance, especially, I think, Professor, it's been written a lot, so could you comment on that? And Keke Reginald also asked about just one or two comments, thoughts on using archaeology to determine Igbo origin. So I think with that, once you answer that, then we'll wrap up this our enjoying discussions.
Yeah, I think Biko as a sociologist, I think he knows more on this more than myself, but I think one has to understand the Igbo system, and as one that in many ways that the Igbo were non-territorial in terms of the idea of imposing hegemony, right, on others. And so I think that is at the core of how the Igbo respond to others, and matters between the Igbo and other, or within even intra-Igbo groups. The idea of Igbo, to shed blood, is also, I think, a very important spiritual element of Igbo worldview, because violence often, there were wars and conflicts, but people often try to negotiate, right? Even when somebody dies, people try to negotiate to find a way out of that before people resort to violence. And I think that is a very good way to understand that non-territorial attitude of the Igbo, the idea and absence of an attempt to impose hegemony on others, the reverence the Igbo have for life and sanctity of life, and I think is important element of Igbo, peace and conflict resolution strategy. So archaeology, I think, is very important. Like we haven't done much this. I mean, if you look at Ibuku is actually very recent in terms of how we can push back Igbo history using archaeology. It's fascinating if you go to Leje in Nsukka and see the iron slugs there, right? That date back to over 300,000 years in Nsukka. Then you can begin to understand how the antiquity of iron smelting, for example, and how that can help us reconstruct the Igbo political economy and existence and habitation in different cultural areas. So it's an area that I think would need to be emphasized in order to reconstruct the Igbo past.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a quick information for those of us in literature, and to add to what you said, I think Toni Morrison's novel, Song of Solomon, is somehow loosely dependent, based on the so-called the experience of Igbo landing. There's a place called Igbo landing in Georgia. I think it must be Savannah, where he said that a group of Igbo, either wanted to fly back to the Igbo land or committed suicide, however one interprets it. So in that way, one can actually see the so-called Igbo suicide as the refusal to accept slavery. Is similar to what Patrick Henry said, give me freedom or give me death. And it just adds to our understanding of the Igbo's love of freedom. And thank you very much for bringing us and connecting all these loose ends and all these issues. Could you help me give a round of applause to our lecturer, Professor Korieh? And I thank all of you for attending this lecture and for being here, for gracing this prestigious lecture series with your presence. Our next lecture will be on the 29th of January, and that will be by Professor Apollos Moa. So, and look out for more information. You'll be hearing from us. Thank you very much. And
thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you,
Chima Korieh, for a wonderful lecture.
All right, thank you.
We are well fed. Thank you very much, sir. Bye.
Chima, Dalo, if you're still here.
Thank you.